Okay, so to finish up our coding demo from Thursday, we looked at the bar chart and kind of a fancier version of the bar chart. Now we're going to look at building an interactive scatter plot. So to do that, there's two files that we're going to look at in our repository. We have a scatter.html file, which I have open here. So we'll go through this in a second. And we also have a Pokemon.csv. So this is our data set. Any Pokemon fans here? Pokeheads, is that the term? Yeah. I was around with like OG on the original Game Boy Pokemon. So I have a lot of street cred, I think. Anyways. Okay, so our data set, so it's a tabular data set, right? So here's our header information. Our first column is what's called an index column. So, right, it's just kind of a count. Like this is the index for each of our Pokemon characters. Then the name of the character is our second column, right? The type of character, right? So categorical attribute, the different types, and the type 1 and type 2. And then we have a bunch of ordered attributes that mostly ordered attributes, not the last one, that talk about their various their various skill levels. And then the last one would be a Boolean, right? So this could be considered a categorical, right? True or false. Okay. So let me just run this. Let me run what we have right now, and we can look at what we got and start building our scatter plots. Okay, so we have, you can see here on the page, we have a set of 3 drop-downs. Right, so we have 3 drop-downs and a rectangle here. So this is going to be an SVG. On the HTML page, right, so up here in our head file, we're linking to the D3 library. We have a CSS style block here. So, right, we have an SVG selector, which is going to correspond to this rectangle here. So you can see that we're setting the width and the height of the SVG and giving it a border. And then we have a couple of other just CSS tags here. So this select selector, right? So this is going to select HTML elements of the select type. So these drop-downs right here, these are selects. So it's just going to set some spacing to the right and the bottom of those. And then we'll look at these later. Okay, so in the body of our HTML, we have 3 drop-downs. So here's the code for the first one. There's an exposition label. We're going to add a space. So ampersand MBSP semicolon is how you do a space in HTML. And then we'll say select. So this is going to be our drop-down. We give it an ID. On change, right? So we're going to call some JavaScript function called draw scatter plot. And you notice when I highlighted that so any of our drop-downs, all 3 of our drop-downs, anytime we change one of them, we're going to call the same function. And what that function is going to do is it will draw or update our scatter plot based on whatever the selections are in our select boxes. Okay. So for our scatter plot, we can set what we want to map the x-axis to, what we want to map the y-axis to, and what we want to map the color of the circles to. Okay. Okay, so below that, you see here we have an SVG. Now, in the previous examples, I had, I'd given the SVG an ID tag. Here, I'm going to show you a way to do it without giving the SVG an ID tag. Okay, so it's just another way to access this sort of element without explicitly doing it using an ID. The way we do that is like this. So we say const SVG equals D3 select SVG. So what this line of code is going to do is it's going to go look through our document object model for the first element it can find of type SVG. Okay. Now, because we've only got one SVG on our page, it will find this one right here. But like if we had, a second one, this line of code would return a reference to the first one on the page, right? So it would not return this one right here. So in the instance that you only have one SVG, this is an okay way to access it. But if you have multiple ones, just be aware that it's always going to get a reference to the first one. Okay, so get a reference to the SVG. Let's set a couple of layout variables. So let's get the width, whatever the width of the SVG is. Let's get the height of the SVG. So this will be up here. It'll be a width of 600 pixels and a height of 400 pixels. And so these lines are the same as on the bar and the fancy bar examples. We'll set a margin, right? So kind of the spacing within the SVG around our chart. We'll get and we'll figure out the inner width and the inner height. And we're going to create a global variable to store our Pokemon CSV file that we're going to import. Okay. So we're going to initialize the variable, but right now, because we're not setting it to anything, it's just going to be equal to like a null, JavaScript's equivalent of a null. Okay, now you can see here is our draw scatterplot function. But before we jump into that, let's go all the way to the bottom of the page and import our data and do a little bit of data cleaning. Let's go all the way down here. All right. What are we doing? Load our data, do some basic data cleaning, set our imported data to our global Pokemon data variable, and then we're going to call this draw scatterplot function. Okay. All right, so d3.csv, load the Pokemon data file. It's going to store it into a JavaScript object called data. And once it finishes doing that, once the file has been fully imported and stored in the file, we're going to run an anonymous JavaScript function. That's what that arrow notation means. And that function is defined inside these curly brackets here. So we're going to run the logic in those brackets after we import the file. Okay? Okay, so what are we doing? So let's see here. Convert these attributes from string to number type. Okay, so if you remember, right, even though our CSV file, right, we have a bunch of numbers, right? These columns are numbered data. It's ordered data. When D3 loads it, it doesn't know that. So we have to do a little bit of data cleaning. It'll just default to being a string. So we're going to convert these from strings to numbers. Okay, so data.map. This is another way to iterate through an array. So it's kind of like a for each or a for loop. And as it loops through that, it's going to run a function. And that function is defined right here. Okay, so for each item in our data array, run a function, and D is going to be like the object at, it'll be each object, okay? So D is like the object at the 0 index, the object at the 1 index, the object at the 2 index, right? So when we say D dot attack, okay, that'll get a reference to that object's attack attribute. So we'll get a reference to it. That plus sign will convert it from a string to a number, and we're just going to save it right back to the same variable, the same property. Okay. So we'll do that with all of our numerical attributes, and you can see here those correspond to the options that we have here. So that way we don't have to convert the data from strings to numbers whenever we want to redraw our scatter plot. We'll do it once when we import the data, and then it's done. Okay, and so you see here we do a print statement. So if I want to go check my data, I can open up the DevTools using the inspect option here. Oh, why'd that do that? There we go. Okay. Right, and so you can see here, this is an array of 800 points that we imported. So here's the first 100 points, right? Item 0, Bulbasaur. I hope that corresponds here. Yep, so Bulbasaur. And you can see that for all of the attributes that we did this casting, this conversion from a string to a number, right? In the JavaScript console, you can actually see those are stored as numbers, right? The ones that we didn't convert, like the number sign, the generation, we didn't convert the special attack or special defense, right? Those are still stored as strings in our data set. Now, this could cause an issue, right? If I try to draw these on like a scatter plot or a bar chart, if it's a string, it'll try to draw it, but it could be some weird, it won't draw it like you think it's going to draw it, right? It could draw it at like a negative value or something like that. Give some weird behavior. So one kind of common issue that people have sometimes, they forget to like convert their object or their data attributes to like the correct format, a number, or sometimes like date objects, JavaScript date objects. If you don't convert it correctly, your number might be put at like -500. And you're like, why is it doing that? This does not make sense. So that's a good thing to check if you're kind of like, I don't understand why this is happening. Because JavaScript will try to plot it and it won't give you an error message necessarily. It'll just plot it and nothing shows up on your screen. Okay. So you might have noticed here we also had an error message here. So that's happening because I'm calling this draw scatter plot function, and that function doesn't actually exist yet. It's still commented out above. So that's what's causing this this not defined message. And then the other thing we did here, we'll set our data to our global Pokemon data attribute. Okay, next. Let's actually go up and start going through this this draw scatter plot function. Okay. Let's uncomment that. And let's go uncomment the close brace here. Go all the way back in here. And it's right there. Okay. So if we save this, yeah, so now our error message went away. But nothing's getting drawn yet because all of the logic inside this function is currently commented out. So let's go through and actually draw our scatter plot. Okay, so draw a scatter plot, it's going to be called two ways. The first way it gets called is when the page loads. When the page loads, this d3.csv is going to get executed, and it will call this draw scatter plot. Right, so that's the first place it'll get called. The second place it'll get called is anytime one of these values changes, right? So And that's because those drop downs have this on change draw scatter plot. So anytime I change this, anytime I select a different value, that will also call this draw scatter plot function. Okay. So what we want to do then is the first time that we call this function, there's nothing on our SVG. So we want to draw the scatter plot. But any subsequent times it gets called, we'll want to update the scatter plot, right? Redraw it with the updated values. Okay, first thing, let's actually figure out what we want to draw. So get the current values, get the current attributes from the dropdowns, right? So defense, defense, attack. Now, there's multiple ways in JavaScript to read a value, read the currently selected value from a select element, okay? There's lots of ways to do this. So I am going to show you 3 different ways to do it. There are more ways than this, okay? But these are just 3 different ways to do it. Okay, the first way, using D3, I can say D3.select, select my column 1 select, which is this one right here. So this will select that select, okay? And I can say dot property value. That will get the currently selected element from that, or the currently selected value from that dropdown. Now this property value here, if we go back up to this, you see here, attack, defense, HP, that is what's going to actually be shown here. This value right here, that's what that's what's going to be read with this D3 call. So this dot property value is going to read this right here. Okay, it's not going to read this attack. It's going to read the one inside the value property. Okay. Now, why is that important? Well, you know, I could say something like "show me the attack," right? I could come up with a more complex kind of name for that element, but when I read it, what I'm going to read would still be attack, even if what's shown is a little bit more complex. Okay. Okay, so that's one way to do it. Another way to do it is like this. So this is kind of the vanilla JavaScript way. Yeah.
Just had a quick question about the option element. It had a closing tag of value, but the opening tag is option. Is that correct? Is that how it is?
Where? Oh, right here. Oh.
Yeah.
Oh, it does, doesn't it? You know what? I think that is incorrect. I think that's bad HTML. I think these should all be options. Yeah. Still worked though. I don't know why it worked, but you're exactly right. That should be an option. Yeah, nice catch. You're the first person in 2 semesters who's noticed that. So good job. Yes, that should say option. You're exactly right. Yeah. So to digress a little bit and make me look better, it worked and I didn't notice it. Okay. Would this work on every browser? I don't know. Chrome was smart enough to figure out what I was trying to do. And actually, you know what? Let's go look in the DOM and see how it rendered it. Let's see. So if I go look in the document object model, go click that right there. So look here. So when Chrome actually parsed that page and built the DOM, you see it says option, value, attack, attack, closed it with an option. So right, Chrome was smart enough to fix my mistake. Right, and if I'd submitted this as part of a homework, I guess I would get full credit. So good job, me. Not always like that though. And that can also be a bit of a very frustrating thing for people is you might make a mistake and it might get fixed kind of by the browser being smart enough to recognize what you did. Or it could have made an issue, but maybe not to the extent that like it logs a console error, right? Something that's like, you did this wrong. It'll just try to execute, and somewhere down there, it'll just cascade to the point that some other error gets thrown, or the page just renders incorrectly, but there's no errors. So yeah, I mean, that's one thing that can certainly be a frustration when you work on browser-based front ends. But yeah, nice catch. I should fix that in the repository. Okay, let's come back here. So I actually am showing you 2 ways to do it, not 3 ways. So the first and the third way, that's doing a D3 select. For the Y attribute, this is kind of the basic vanilla JavaScript way to do it. So not using a D3 function, but using a built-in JavaScript function. So get some element in the document object model based on its ID, right, and just get its value. So that'll be the currently selected value. Now you might notice right here, because with the D3 call, I have to put the pound sign. So this D3 call I can select based on a class. I can select the name of an element. It's kind of like a CSS selector. I have to tell it what type of select I want to do. In basic JavaScript, the function knows I'm selecting an element based on some ID name. So I don't have to put the pound sign there. All right. And then I'm just going to print out the 3 values that I got, if I want to debug it that way. Next, let's create our X and Y scales. So in this case, X and Y can both be linear scales. Lots of different scales out there, right? So D3 supports like power scales, log scales. The documentation is really good. One thing to note though, right? The Y scale, we're going to reverse the order that we draw the Y scale from. Because if you remember, when we're thinking about positions on an SVG, our 0, 0 point is top left, right? But when you're drawing a chart, we're probably going to put our 0, 0 right here, right? So we want our Y, the bottom of our Y axis to be here, and we want it to go up. So one way we can achieve that is we'll just reverse our range. So we're going from bottom to top instead of top to bottom. All right, so you'll see what I mean here in a second. Okay, for our X scale, so we want to create a D3 linear scale linear. The domain, the data space, is going to go from 0 to the maximum value for our X attribute, okay? So what's going to happen? So D3 max is going to iterate through all of the elements in our Pokemon data array, and for each element in that array, it's going to run a JavaScript anonymous function that's just going to return whatever this value is. So whatever its X attribute value, okay? So every element, it's going to return that value, and then we're just going to take whatever the max of that is. So over all 800 Pokemon in our array. So that's what this line of code is going to do. And then our range is just going to go from 0 to whatever the size of our chart is, okay? The Y scale is going to do a similar thing. So we're gonna say a scale linear. Our data space is going to go from 0 to whatever the maximum in our array. For each element, get whatever its Y attribute value is. Okay, so get the max of all 800, and it's going to go from 0 to whatever that maximum value is. The pixel space, though, instead of going from 0 to the width, we're going to go from whatever the height is back up to 0. So we're going backwards, okay? So reversing that is going to put this as our actual 0, 0 point, and we're going to go up instead of starting at the top and going down, okay? So that's what that reversal does right there. Okay, next. let's create a color scale, right? So we also have a color option here. Let's create a color scale based on this C attribute value, right? Whatever the color value is. D3 has a lot of flexibility in terms of color scales. I'm going to show a couple of examples here. So you can use a manual color scale. So this would be an example of a manual color scale. I could say something like a scale linear. My data space is going to be the different values. Okay, so the min and max, all the different values, the different number values. It's going to map whatever the min and the max of those are to two predefined colors that I give it. Okay, so I could say go from light blue to magenta. So whatever the minimum value is for this attribute, that's going to map to light blue. Whatever the maximum value is for this attribute, that's going to map to magenta. Okay, and so D3 extent is just a shorthand way to say run D3 min and also run D3 max. So get both values, both the min and the max, as opposed to something like, you know, just run D3 max, right? And I will give you the minimum, right? So this is how I could do a manual color scale. The other option is I could do a pre-built color scale. So scale sequential is a type of color scale provided by D3 that does a sequential data type, right? So some like min to max ordered attribute. So for this one, I would just say create a sequential color scale using a pre-built color map. And this specific name of this one is called interpolate red, yellow, green. And again, the data space is just going to be this color extent. So I don't have to give it a range here. This interpolate red, yellow, green is going to substitute for that. So if you go look at the GitHub documentation, copy this and open it up. You can see all of the different color scales that D3 provides, right? So there's categorical color scales, but what we care about right now are sequential color scales. So they have diverging color scales and sequential, right? So they have single hue sequential color scales, and they have multi-hue color scales. So something like, where's the one I care about? Is it this one? No. Somewhere in here. Oh, is that one? No. Somewhere in there. Right, so there's lots of color scales that you can pick. Oh. Okay, now. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to do something a little counterintuitive. We're going to clear anything that's drawn on our SVG, okay? The reason we're going to do this, okay? So at this point in time, right, the first time I call this function, I haven't even drawn anything on the SVG yet. So if I go, oops, like if I go look at this in my DevTools, so if I go look at the SVG, right, you'll see here there's nothing actually drawn. So this line, so svg.selectG, well, there's no G elements in our SVG. So that'll be what's called an empty selection. And .remove, which would remove any of those elements, is not actually going to do anything because it's removing something that just doesn't, it didn't find anything to remove. So the first time I call this, because there's nothing that's drawn, it's not going to do anything. And it's not going to throw any errors, which is what we want, but nothing will get removed because nothing has been drawn yet. But the next time I call this draw scatterplot function, something will have been drawn on the page, right? We'll draw our scatter plot. So we don't want the previous scatter plot to be there, and then we draw another scatter plot on top of it, right? Because then there's two scatter plots, and the points will start, cluttering each other. So what this is going to do, before we draw anything new, say anything that exists on our SVG, grab it and clear it. Then when we add the points again, we're drawing on a blank slate. So it's like wipe it and redraw it is what's happening. Okay. Okay, so let's start drawing. All right, so the first thing we're going to do, let's get a reference to our G element. So we'll say svg.append G, and we'll shift our G over a little bit based on our margins. So now if I save this, okay, you can see that we have a G element here. Okay. If I do this, right, you see how it flashed purple like that? That indicates that something changed. And specifically what changed is we actually deleted that and we drew another one. And so if I comment out this svg.selectg.remove, if I save that, now if I change something, all right, so you see that now we have two G's here. If I do it again, now there's 3 G's, 4G, 5G, and so on. Okay, so this remove is going to keep us from it'll clear what we've drawn, so we're drawing on a blank slate. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do is let's draw our circles. Okay, so G.selectAllCircle. So what that's going to say is select all of the circle elements in our SVG that are underneath our G element. Again, that's going to be an empty selection because there's no circles that actually exist on our page. But that's exactly what we want, because to that empty selection, we're going to bind some data. And for each data point, we want to draw one circle. So what we're saying is, for each of our Pokemon, all 800 points, we want to append a circle. And each circle that we append, give it these attribute properties and these CSS styles. Okay? So each circle we append, we will give it an ID property. And that ID property is based on the name of the item, except we're going to do a string replace. So the ID doesn't have any spaces in it. We'll just replace them with underscores. And then the X position of the circles will be based on our X scale for whatever the X attribute value is. And our Y position is based on our Y scale of whatever the Y attribute value is. Okay? And the radius of the circle, we'll just set that constant equal to 3. Okay? So let me save this, and stuff should show up. Let me save this. Okay, cool. All right, so the X position is based on the X attribute value of that. Now, you may be wondering, like, what is this X attribute actually supposed to, what does that mean? Well, it's based on whatever this dropdown is, right? So what we're basically saying is D attack. That's basically what we're calling. Or D dot attack. So that's basically the value that we're returning. And we're passing that to our X scale, which is going to map it from a data space, right? So that value is going to be between the 0 and whatever the max is to some pixel space. Right? And then we're going to plot it on our SVG based on that pixel space. We're going to do the same thing with the y-axis, with the y value. So D dot defense. So we'll go to the y scale and say, whatever that value is in data space, map it to this pixel space, right? And keep in mind, this is reversed, right? So it's going to go from 0 to the top, right? Because we reversed this. Now, if we didn't reverse it, right? If I save this, you'll see that the chart flips like this. Why did it do that? Like break something? 186.
maintaining the, yes.
Oh, yeah, okay. Yeah. And there we go. Yeah, bad to just doodle on live code. It's a good way to get in trouble. Okay, so let me show you flipping it. Let's see here. Where's our Y scale? Right there. Okay, so if I don't reverse it, right? If I delete these, and I save this, right now you can see it's backwards, it's reversed. So I don't want to do that. Okay, and there's some other properties here that I have commented out, but you can play with those on your own. So, okay, next. Before we do a gradient, let's add the axes and the axes labels. So, oops. So this code is similar to what we did on the bar chart, right? This is just going to add our X and Y axis and two axis labels, right? Right, and keep in mind with an X-axis, right, it's a bottom scale, which means the tick marks are going to be on the bottom. We have to push it from the top of the visualization to the bottom, right? So we do a translate to do that. Okay, so last thing for today, let me show you how to make a gradient, a color scale. So let me just uncomment this and save it. Okay. So this is not the most intuitive code in D3, and I shamelessly ripped it off from this example. So you are free to do the same thing, in your own homework. But basically what we're doing here is we're setting up a couple of dimensions, like where do we want our color legend to be placed? What's its height and its width? And we're defining a linear gradient in SVG and drawing it as a rectangle and filling it with this linear gradient. And then on the bottom of that, we're adding an axis like this. So that's what that axis is doing right there. And then we'll add a label just like that. So the cool thing is, if I change, right, from attack to something else, you can see that it updates, right, and right, it updates dynamically. And so same thing here. If I change one of these, right, because we're clearing our canvas, we're redrawing it. It's re-updating. Okay, so that is it for this lecture. Any questions? This is a good lecture, especially as you go into homework 2, right? Because you have to do exactly this, right? You select a country, you have to redraw your lollipop chart. So you'll do a very similar thing to this in homework 2. All right, see y'all Thursday.
Yep. I like that's projects. Basically, like way over my head. Like,